Welcome to the Ottawa International Writers Festival. My name is Sean. I'm the festival's artistic director. We are broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. On behalf of the festival and our partners, the Ottawa Public Library and Library and Archives Canada, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you this evening. If you'd like to watch this event en français, just head over to the Library and Archives Canada YouTube page where they are providing simultaneous translation. Quart, Ottawa Queer Arts Collective, is proud to be associated with tonight's Missing from the Village event. Since 2018, Quart Ottawa has been led as a collective by Ottawa-based artists and arts professionals with community advisors. Their mandate is to program and promote 2S LGBTQ+ and queer artistic activities and to boost creativity, social justice, and cultural sector opportunities within Ottawa's queer communities. Quart Ottawa also works to better support local emerging artists from equity-seeking communities, including their recent Artist Microgrant initiative alongside the In Our Tongues Reading and Arts series. On Friday, October 16th on Zoom, Quart will host a session on local queer identified artists that is also an info session to help artists get funded more easily through the City of Ottawa's Diversity in the Arts Fund. A program officer will be there to answer all your online questions. Find out more about Quart, the Ottawa Queer Arts Collective, through Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books, but wherever you are right now, there is an independent bookseller nearby or online who would be more than happy to sell you a copy of Justin's book. I want to thank you in advance for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. If you enjoyed this session, please visit us at writersfestival.org to make a donation, sign up for upcoming events, or to enjoy our virtual season on demand. It's as simple as pressing play. Our host this evening is an award-winning Ottawa-based journalist, Matthew Pearson, who recently joined the faculty at the School of Journalism and Communications at Carleton University. Let's give a warm virtual welcome to our host, Matthew Pearson.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate the warm welcome, and I appreciate Sean's land acknowledgement. I too am coming to folks tonight from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin. And I am pleased to be here, and I am pleased to interview someone whose work I admire as a colleague and who I watched at least for a decade, as many of you probably have. I want to obviously caution folks that tonight we will be discussing some difficult material. Justin's story probes a difficult subject, and that may come up at times in our conversation. I also want to let folks know that I'm taking some care in the questions that I ask in terms of not needing to go down all the dark paths that we could, but that is a caution that I want to share. And that this material is hard to hear, and I recognize that. And I just hope that in this community, as much as we can create it in this online environment, we can take care of each other and take care of ourselves. So with that, I think that I wanted to start by chatting with Justin, but I think even before we get started, maybe I will let Justin share a reading from the book, Missing from the Village. Thank you, Justin.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the really wonderful welcome. Thanks to the Ottawa Writers Fest for having me. I'm going to dive right in. I've been doing a handful of events around the book coming out, and I've been trying to think about different sections I can kind of I can read. And this is a section I don't think I thought of until sort of today, and it's just one that I've been ruminating on a little more, and I think we can expand on a little bit why that is a little bit later. But it's a section later in the book about Bruce McArthur's I believe sixth known victim, Krishna Kumar Kanagaratnam. And it's a story, I think, that that exposes how many things come into play in this story, and from places that you never expect. From stories that and from people that you never would have imagined would have been intertwined into this story. And so this is chapter 14. On July 24th, 2010, a rusted ship crawled through the waters off Canada's west coast. Weeks earlier, it had tried to dock in Australia, but was turned away. Then it had been spotted off the coast of Guatemala. The Coast Guard were keeping an eye on the ship, but as one Canadian Forces official confessed to the Globe and Mail, as long as it's on the high seas and proceeding with peaceful intent, there is no legal framework for inhibiting its journey. TV news blared images of the woe-begotten ship as it approached port in Vancouver, its grubby blue and red hull spewing water from various cracks. the whole ship listed to one side as though it were set to lie down and never get up. The deck was blanketed in silhouettes, peering out towards the shore. On board the MV Sun Sea were 492 Tamil refugees, escaping the still smoldering civil war in Sri Lanka. They had been at sea for months, hoping desperately that some country would take them in, even though they were flouting international standards of refugee law. They hoped the risky voyage would bring them a better life. One man had died during the journey, his illness treatable, but not in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Quote, the day that we reached the shores of Canada as refugees was the day we found courage and hope in our hearts, recalled Piravan Tarangil. That optimism landed roughly as the asylum seekers learned the harsh realities of Canada's immigration policies. It was 2 weeks after they reached Canadian waters before the ship docked in Vancouver. That didn't end the harrowing journey for those aboard. Vic Hayes, then Canada's public safety minister, announced that the migrants would be detained to ensure our refugee system is not hijacked by criminals or terrorists. The government made an example of the MV Sun Sea, in part to deter future asylum seekers from landing in Canada. A year before, another ship, the MV Ocean Lady, had similarly docked in Vancouver. Ottawa was not looking to play host to a third ship, no matter how treacherous the journey or how desperate the migrants' cause. Ottawa insisted that some, maybe all of those aboard the ship were members of the Tamil Tigers, which Canada considers a terrorist organization. They were all detained while the Canadian Border Services Agency fought to have them deported. A pregnant passenger was the first to be released a month later. Others sat in detention for 6 months. But Canada's immigration system, while often arbitrary and unfair, was still one of laws. In the end, fully 228 of those who came to Canada on the MV Sun Sea were, according to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, refugees. Another 116 had their claims denied. The board rejected most of those claims because, as the Civil War had officially ended, the government concluded they had no longer faced risks at home. The government established that just 11 of those who arrived on the MV Sun Sea were members of the Tamil Tigers. Evidently mortified by the higher number of refugees accepted into Canada from aboard the ship, the government introduced the Preventing Human Smuggling from Abusing Canada's Immigration System Act in 2011, which codified the mass detention process and fast-tracked the application of refugees who arrived as part of a group with an eye to kneecapping their ability to make claims. One of those 116 who had their claims denied was Krishnakumar Kanagaratnam. He was ordered removed from the country, but unlike many of the others, Kanagaratnam was never deported. I can stop there and pick it up later, but that's just a little bit of the, of the introduction to one of, the victims, who disappeared and who unfortunately was never even reported missing from the village. And I think one story that maybe even hit me the hardest in working, on this story for, as long as I have.
Well, I mean, maybe we should start there then. Why that story of all the stories? I mean, the book is about 8 men who went missing. But that story comes a bit later in the book. It comes a bit later in the timeline of the case. What are the intersections that story brings up in this story, would you say?
Yeah, so, when we talk about the story, we tend to talk about, often when I have to introduce the story, I talk about the fact that 3 men disappeared from the village between 2010 and 2012. And that's initially what kind of started the story. That's what started my interest in the story. That's where a lot of the story begins. That's what originally got the Toronto police, interested in the idea that there is something kind of wrong in the village. And then, of course, we talk, about the most recent 2 victims, Andrew Kinsman and Saleem Essen, whose disappearances kind of restarted that whole investigation and set off the chain of events that would ultimately lead to Bruce McArthur's arrest in early 2018. But I think what gets lost a lot of the time, and even my talking about this story or a lot of the coverage, is that the fact that there were victims in between who get overlooked and whose stories are almost more troubling because they weren't reported missing, or they were reported missing and ultimately, not fulsomely investigated. And I think that is something that is, I think really a worthwhile takeaway here. So Krishnakumar Kanagaratnam comes over to Canada on the MV Sun Sea in 2011. He files for refugee status, amidst a culture where he's being painted as a terrorist or a fraudster or a criminal. In fact, he had someone in his family murdered as part of that civil war and feared retribution for his own life. He came to Canada, through great expense of his own, through great risk of his own, only to be arrested, detained, and ultimately ordered deported. He spent months, I think more than a year actually, living in fear that he would be rounded up and deported as he exhausted all of his claims and his appeals processes. And it was in that sort of desperation that he ultimately, was disappeared. That, even as his family knew something was wrong and wasn't hearing back from him and knew that, he was either missing or had gone underground, they didn't feel comfortable reporting him missing to police because they feared that, he chose to disappear and that, any police report would only call attention to him and would ultimately jeopardize his life by having him, deported back to Sri Lanka. And it was in that, that Bruce McArthur targeted him, abducted him, and ultimately it's what led to his death. So it's one thing that it comes back to me a lot because for all of the supposed solutions that we're talking about, that we often talk about when it comes to marginalized people, all too often this respect, the respect of refugee claimants or immigration claimants who often kind of end up living off the grid, gets overlooked a lot. And really, of all the people in our society, they have no or little healthcare, little support networks, little access to language training, little access to job markets, so on and so forth. It makes them almost the perfect storm. And often do they experience PTSD, mental health struggles, and so forth. It makes them the most vulnerable in this system. And I think it's something that we are seemingly very comfortable overlooking and sort of dancing over.
Well, and I think picking up on that, I mean, your book not only probes the role of homophobia and maybe, I think there is many examples of homophobia at the hands of police in its dealings with the community, but it does also look at the wider role that race played. And I wonder, how the disappearances didn't seem to capture the attention of the wider queer community. And there's all kinds of ways that you, I think, really smartly at the start of the book unpack both the words queer and the word community and what happens when we put them together. But if we accept queer community in that period between 2010 and 2012, do you think, having done the work that you've done, that race did play an element in how those stories didn't grab the attention of the wider community?
It's hard. So, we're talking about 8 people who disappeared over the span of 7 years, right? And like I said, you can break it in sort of the first 3 missing persons cases. They disappeared between 2010 and 2012. When it came to each one of their disappearances, there was, to varying degrees, an investigation. There were, to varying degrees, a community response. Skandaraj Navaratnam was the first man to go missing in 2010. When he vanished, his friends, within hours of his disappearance, put it together and immediately went to police, immediately started searching, any place that he could reasonably have been, immediately tried his phone, started putting up posters, started organizing searches. And that was a community-led effort. There was a bar he went to frequently where his friends worked called Zippers. This is sort of the lower end of Toronto's queer gay village. And it turned into sort of an organizing hub. People would come in, collect posters, go out into Church Street, go out into other neighborhoods and put posters up. He was also Sri Lankan. He was also, racialized. He was a refugee. He, according to many of his friends, experienced symptoms of PTSD. He had his own struggles, but he also had a support network and sort of a chosen family that, when he disappeared, activated and moved swiftly and really started pressing to get answers about what had happened to their friend. Unfortunately, that didn't come. There was a police investigation. It didn't turn up any solid leads as to where he was, and unfortunately, he was sort of left to just lying in a filing cabinet somewhere. About later that year, Abdulbasir Faizi goes missing, also a refugee from Afghanistan. he's not really a member of the community in the same way. Spent time at some Church Street bars, but had a wife and a family back home who was sort of unaware about the time he spent in the village. There was not the same community activation when he disappeared. There was not the same effort by bars and shops and local activists to go find him. His wife was ultimately left pushing Peel police where he lived and Toronto police to get their act together and to launch a fulsome investigation. And I think there's probably a pretty good argument to be made that the original investigation into his disappearance was mediocre at best, in part because of the divisional problems between Peel and Toronto police. Now, Majeed Kayhan, the third man did go missing, and I won't go person by person here, but just to showcase that, Majeed was more or less openly gay. He was out in the village. He lived in the village. He lived with his partner for a time. His intimate family knew he was queer. He had friends in the village. He spent time at bars, but he just didn't have the same kind of social network that really would have activated and led to a postering campaign, led to park searches, led to a campaign in the media. But his friends went to police and said, here's everything I know. Here's his ex-boyfriend. Here's everything I can give you about my friend Majeed that might be helpful. In each of those disappearances, the outcomes weren't tremendously different. These were difficult cases to solve. There was very little in terms of physical evidence. There was very little in terms, of direction where they may have gone. There were the requisite checks, there were the credit card checks, there were the internet checks, the phone checks, but nothing really came back. It wasn't until 2013, thanks to an anonymous tip that sort of had nothing to do with this investigation, came in that ultimately a really kind of eagle-eyed detective put two and two together and realized that he had 3 missing persons cases in a geographically dense neighborhood, of 3 men who, by the way, looked really similar, all had facial hair, all were racialized, all were queer to some degree, all were around the same age, all had a similar build. And that's when this story kind of first sets out, and the police first say, we have 3 missing persons cases that may be connected. Because at that point, the community sort of, went into panic, and there was a sense of dread and there was a sense of fear that kind of permeated the village that summer. Ultimately, it still didn't lead to an arrest. So, it's sort of some of the question is, what did race have to do with it? It's tough, right? Like you can't just say a racialized person doesn't get an investigation or doesn't get their case taken seriously. What the case you probably can make is that it takes a lot more work, right? And I think this is maybe a shared reality for a lot of racialized people that who've spoken to me, is that it's not that you have no hope whatsoever. It's that you just need to work that much harder to convince the police, to convince the media, to convince the city, to convince the community that this case or some case like it is worthwhile, is worth their time, is worth that investigation, is worth that hit on the evening news. And it's tough, it's tough. And throughout this case, there's all of these intersections of mental health, of refugee status, of race, of sexuality, of participation in sex work, of being street involved, of all these number of things that kind of intersect with each of these men's lives, that just exposed all of the forces that work against you in circumstances like this, and how hard you need to work to convince the city at large to take your case seriously. And it's frustrating, and it's not I wish I could say that there was sort of a bright line to this. There's some case where we can kind of point to and say this is how things are working better. But in this case, there's not really an example of that.
I also want to pick up on homophobia for a sec, because there's a part in your book where you say these profiles, and you're talking about the online profiles that some of the men had, these profiles would spark all sorts of moralizing in the media. The tone of the coverage suggested the network of online dating sites were seedy, dangerous, dark. And so I wonder, to what degree did a sort of, mainstream, perhaps largely straight media have in terms of covering this story, and how they maybe didn't understand all the ins and outs of what some of these online profiles in the community might have meant.
Yeah, so I think the media angle there is one worth focusing on. it's really difficult to put together a thoughtful story built around someone's dating profile. You know, I mean, that's just the blunt reality of it. You know, imagine, you know, someone getting access to your Tinder account and trying to, you know, build a thoughtful feature about your life using it. It's a kind of an absurd thought, yet it's something we seem very, you know, okay with doing when it comes to queer people, you know, as though some of these dating apps will unlock some greater truth about, you know, their queer identity. And it's frustrating. And it is usually, it's usually fruitless. I mean, it's usually, you know, an exercise in futility. When it specifically came to Bruce McArthur and when it came to Andrew Kinsman, you know, the media was very happy to sort of lay out a lot of, you know, the identities that they built for themselves on dating profiles, on social media, and sort of in some cases even draw parallels. You know, there was one newspaper report that decided to hone in on Andrew Kinsman's fascination with serial killers. And it didn't do a good job of explaining, you know, that fascination was, you know, not an adoration. You know, there was plenty of people who have a fascination with serial killers, but because, you know, he's the victim of one, to lay that out in newspaper print was a really gross and unpleasant thing to do, and it's not something I think we would have done if this was not a queer person. You know, I think you have to tread very, very carefully, you know, when you do this, because I think there's a real easy there's a simplicity of looking at queer victims, or, you know, queer folks who have been the victims of crime, and to look at them as sort of foreign and strange and from 1,000 miles off, and therefore you kind of need to do some sociology when you look at the remnants of their life, and it's just not necessary. You know, when it came to Andrew Kinsman, when it came to many of these men, there were people out there who were happy to talk about them, you know, their lives. You don't need to go read the tea leaves of their social media or their dating profiles, you know, to conclude, you know, what they were really like. And that's, that was a really frustrating thing for me. And on the flip side of that, you know, when it came to McArthur's dating profiles, you know, I reported on his dating profiles as well, but you know, I spent hours agonizing over what words to use, what pictures to use, and in many respects, it required some, you know, actual level of, you know, of literacy, you know, in queer subcultures, right? You know, there were straight reporters out there, you know, with very little frame of reference for what a bear is, you know, what BDSM is, what a lot of these things are, and were bewildered and sort of befuddled as they were trying to report on this through the news. And, you know, it is one of the prime examples of why diverse newsrooms are an absolute necessity. If you don't have a queer person in your newsroom, you know, and ideally not just one, if you don't have several queer people in your newsroom who you can go and say, hey, listen, I'm on Grindr, or I'm on, you know, whatever dating app, and ask for some help from them, you know, you're going to be in a weird spot. You're going to make mistakes. You are going to misrepresent something, and it's going to have consequences. So I think that was absolutely present in a lot of the coverage, which is unfortunate. But, you know, what's almost frustrating is it is also very present in the police investigation. But I will say it was not as bad as it could have been. You know, I've read through a fair bit of the investigative record on this file that goes back all the way to 2010, 2013. And, you know, you had officers who were going through these dating profiles seemingly bewildered at a lot of the things they were reading, but they seemed to have the good sense to go and check with somebody. They didn't get everything right. By no means did they get everything right. But, you know, they did do some work to say, okay, well, what does this mean? You know, okay, well, this looks violent. Is it actually violent, or is that just part of the role-playing thing? And, you know, and that's good police work, right? You know, I think I can absolutely imagine an investigation in today's day and age where officers would be very, very willing to just take evidence of interest in BDSM or asphyxiation or whatever as in and of itself evidence of criminality. But these officers did I think the smart thing, and they you know, they thought about it. I don't know for sure, but it looks like they consulted with actual queer folks to help them set them straight on some of these things. And I think that was, and I think maybe, you know, more importantly, they, you know, and this is not true for every interview that happened in this case, but I spoke to several friends of these victims who said, I went into that police station and I spoke about things that I never thought I would be telling a cop about, but they made it feel safe for me to do so. And I think that's a positive thing. I've heard other interviews where, where that was diametrically opposite. I've heard from people who absolutely sat in a room with officers who treated them like they were lesser, treated them like they were subhuman, treated them like they were untrustworthy because they were queer or because they were doing X, Y, and Z. So it's a mixed bag, but I'm saying that there are some positive elements I'm seeing in there with respect to how the police handled some of those questions.
I want to come back to a question about the police, but before I do, I think I want to center the victims here and center some of the folks. So you dedicate the book to the friends and family of the men who went missing and were ultimately victims. And, in the book, it's clear that you developed relationships with some of them over the years. And I wonder just if you would take a couple minutes to introduce us to a few of them, a few of the sort of friends and family members of these men that helped you tell their stories in a way that is, really humanizing. And I don't know if it was your doing, but for instance, like for those of you who haven't picked up the book yet, there is a very nice drawing of each man. So there's no place in your book where there's like in the middle of the book, like 24 pages of glossy photos that are, macabre. There are these very tastefully done drawings. So maybe Justin, you might introduce us.
Yeah, we had thought about using photos, actual photos, and between Facebook, between some folks who are willing to share photos with us, there are photos of many of these men, and some of them are quite nice photos. Some of them are, people would hand me a photo and say, this is exactly how I choose to remember him every day. And, this is the image I want put out in the world. And in those circumstances, I really wanted to use these photos. I actually thought that would be a brilliant thing to make a little kind of library photo book in the middle for those men. The problem is that for several of these men, including Krishna Kumar, who I mentioned at the beginning, there's not a lot of good photos. It's difficult. There's good photos of them earlier in life, but from their time in Toronto, there's just not a lot. And then you get to a question of, well, do I just not use them, or is there something else I can do? And that's ultimately kind of the debate, we had was, how do we best represent them in a way that makes them look like they were happy, that showcases the time before they got caught up in this. Because I think the worst thing you can do is define somebody entirely by the way in which they died. I think that's a really sad concept, and I hope there's some success in deciding that using these illustrations, which were done by a brilliant young illustrator who we found named Lachlan McDonald. I really hope that using those images would kind of immortalize a slightly happier time. And I did my best to try to base those photos on very nice photos of these men that were kind of provided with consent to us over the course of working on this investigation. So the only hope that was some success. When it came to those who kind of helped me through this process, there was a bunch, and I'm not going to name them all because the reality is a lot of the people involved in this story are never chose to be involved with it and have been living this story. It depends on who you are. Some of them have lived this story for, the better part of a decade. Going back to Skandaraj Navaratnam, his friends had to organize for his disappearance in 2010, again in 2013, again in 2017, had to deal with the arrest in 2018 through the earlier trial process, are still fielding, a litany of media requests. And that's difficult. It's difficult to have a decade of your life subsumed by, investigation into a serial killer. That is really a traumatizing experience. And I tried my best. I think there were sacrifices made in the book, to be totally honest, because I wasn't interested in pushing a lot of these folks into reliving this yet again just for the sake of this book. I managed to piece a lot of this together from prior interviews I've done, prior interviews other people have done, from investigative records and from so on. And it wouldn't be worth it to me to make someone go, relive those experiences just to get that really choice quote or to get that one anecdote that I, really wanted for the book. There was a lot of negotiation that I tried to do in making sure that I wasn't pushing people too hard. And I hope there was some success in that regard. But there were a lot of people who who volunteered their time in such a way that was really brilliant. Like Kyle Andrews was a friend of Majeed Kayhan, who invited me into his house in rural Nova Scotia and, you know, sat with me for hours as I kind of probed a bunch of, you know, really difficult questions for him. You know, there many friends of Andrew Kinsman were not only helpful and supportive when it came to you know, actually talking about his history, but in helping you know, liaise with other friends and family of the missing men, you know, when it came to you know, actually, you know, staying in touch with me, providing me updates to specifically his neighbors, the people who lived you know, near in his building, Megan and Robin, his neighbors, or, you know, I mentioned them in the book. Absolutely brilliant in terms of you know, helping me understand some of the specifics of the investigation, you know, letting me in. Megan in particular, kind of, she might be listening, and I'm hoping I'm not misrepresenting, you know, her involvement in this, but, you know, she was instrumental. Like, I don't think I could have done the book without her. You know, she consistently, you know, prodded me to do better, to think more fulsomely about, you know, what trauma means in the course of this investigation, to think more fulsomely about, you know, some aspects of the investigation that, yeah, I think were really important. You know, forcing me to you know, I think, get away from some lazy reporter stereotypes and really delve deep into some areas that were, you know, more difficult to probe in the book. You know, everything from, you know, mental health histories from some of the victims, thinking more fulsomely about, you know, the role PTSD may have played in some of these men's lives. So, you know, I don't think I could have done it. I wouldn't have wanted to do it if I didn't have the buy-in from a lot of those friends and family. And for some, it was a lot harder than others. You know, the reality is, Abdulbasir Faizi, Sarush Mahmoodi, who's the fifth man to go missing, Krishna Kumar Navaratnam, had many family members who, you know, were not fluent in English. And, you know, at various points, we used a translator. You know, I spoke through, you know, asked questions through family members who did speak English. But that's really difficult. It's really difficult to be, you know, in an investigation, in a story, in a really traumatic experience, where you can't converse with the detectives, the media, the other friends and family, you know, so on and so forth in your native tongue. That's really, really difficult. And, you know, it's a massive barrier to cases like this. And unfortunately, there was not a lot of support in their native language for those families, which was, you know, I think one thing that struck me is really disappointing.
Thank you. I'm going to take a pause, Justin, just to let our audience know that there is an opportunity to ask questions. It will probably come up in about 10 or 12 minutes. And there's an option for you to write your questions in the Zoom tool, or leave a comment on Facebook to ask your questions. So just picking up on that, I mean, there's a chapter in the book called "They've All Purported to Listen," and it was about family members and friends, and around you know, the various people in charge who they told. And I wondered what insights you might have gathered from them about, you know, the pain and the trauma of having a missing loved one, because there's a different, I think, pain and different experience than a loved one goes missing and it's a murder and it's a solved situation. This, you know, dragged on. And so, you know, from some of those friend groups, what insights did you gather about the human experience it is to have a missing loved one?
You know, I think it's really, it's unfathomably difficult, because it's, you know, like you point out, it's not a case where, you know, someone vanishes but is unfortunately found dead, and you know, you might be pushing for answers, but there's a level of finality there, that, for lack of a better word, about what has happened, right? There's a certainty about what has happened. That lack of certainty is really, really difficult. I spoke to a friend of Skandaraj Navaratnam, who was actually, her name is Sarah Becker. She was the daughter of one of Skandaraj's best friends. You know, looked at him as an uncle. You know, has only kind of wonderful and fond memories, you know, of Skanda. She told me that when he disappeared, you know, she went out, she put up posters, she went through, you know, a lot of the park searches that the friends had organized. You know, she was doing everything she could to, you know, get this story in the public eye, to try to find answers about what had happened. You know, that was 2010. She told me that over the years, basically every summer, every kind of spring, fall, every time when the weather was good, sometimes even in the winter, she would walk the same route from her job to her home, which brought her through the Don Valley Park, which is basically a big ravine that kind of goes beside the highway. And she was convinced, and actually, you know, I think with some, you know, some accuracy, that her friend was nearby, that she would, you know, and I think kind of bluntly said that she would find his body. And it's a really draining and traumatic thing to do constantly. It's almost ritualistic. You're constantly walking through, you're looking by your feet, you're kicking over, rocks and piles of leaves to just, quite honestly, you expect to see your friend there. And to do that, pretty consistently for 8 years was really hard. And she told me that, while she thought he had died, she wasn't sure. She thought perhaps he had fled, that his life was in danger, and which was not impossible. He actually was a refugee from Sri Lanka and actually had a real fear that his life might have been in danger. She expected that was a possibility. She expected he had just fled, and that she actually told me, she kind of said, maybe one day I open Facebook and there'd be a message from him, and then it would he'd just be telling me, I'm fine, I'm not coming back, but I'm okay, I love you and goodbye. And to live your life like that, just constantly expecting that bit of news, or constantly expecting to find your friend's body, that's like the emotional toll of that is really hard to grasp. And what's worse about it is that that for all intents and purposes, the police have forgotten about the case. If I've spoken to a lot of families and friends of missing people, some involved with the story, some not. And what's been really difficult for a lot of them is that there is always some level of investigation into the missing person, but very often the case can just sort of get forgotten. If you're in Toronto, there was no dedicated missing persons team for years and years. There was no website that cataloged long-term missing people. So even if you were sitting there and say, I want to go promote, my friend's missing persons file, and I want to go, send it out to, let's say another, missing person group in the US to see if they've ever seen him, or to see if they know about his case or whatever. There was no central point on the Toronto Police website where you could do that. There was nothing you could point to. In the US, in British Columbia, and many other jurisdictions, that website is that sort of website is not only used, but is useful. You actually end up finding missing persons. You actually end up solving cases because there's a public facing element to it. In Canada, you don't have that. So a lot of these friends and family are left with the feeling like their case has been forgotten, and then maybe it gets picked up years later, but maybe it doesn't. The Friends of Skandaraj Navaratnam, like I said, saw that case come back in the news in 2013, saw a fresh investigation, only to get forgotten all over again, right up until 2017 when Bruce McArthur was arrested. So that is really difficult. Like it's hard to fully grasp the level of loss and sort of uncertainty that comes with missing someone, but then as a friend of Andrew kind of put it, you're kind of missing them all over again. Like you're not only missing them physically, you're literally missing answers on what had happened. And that's kind of really hard to quantify for people, and it's really unique to missing persons cases, and there's not a lot of support there. There is not a lot of checking in. I spoke to the sister of one missing man who told me that she's the one constantly calling police for updates. Once, twice a year, she'll see stories in the news about a body found, and immediately she's calling the cops to say, is it him, is it him? And that takes a toll on you. You're constantly reliving this. Friends with nightmares. A lot of the friends and family of McArthur's victims talk about just persistent and constant nightmares over years and years and years. And it's a level of kind of grief that is just very particular to these sort of cases. And it's really, everyone reports that everyone I've spoken to has kind of reported that this is a constant struggle to sort of deal with that level of grief.
We do have some questions. I'm going to try to slip in a couple more questions for you. One, we're going to talk about police. The full title of your book is Missing from the Village, the story of serial killer Bruce McArthur, the search for justice, and the system that failed Toronto's queer community. And you've referenced the police. And what I think is so interesting is that this is not an indictment of the police completely. There are many points where you highlight places where the police could have done a better job, but I think you also beautifully in the foreword talk about police, and you've talked here about the good amount of police work that did happen in the investigation. And so I wanted to talk about, what we reckon with that relationship now between the queer community and the police. And I think you also, suggested in the Globe this weekend a possible solution for police services when it comes to missing persons. And so I wonder if you want to talk about what you wrote about in the Globe this weekend, and then expand to the relationship between the queer community in Toronto and the police.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, you used that quote earlier, they've all purported to listen. That was a quote that was said to me by Wally Opal, the former commissioner of the Commission of Inquiry into the missing women from the downtown east side and the crimes of Robert Pickton. The reality is he wrote a absolutely amazing, long, detailed, taxonomical report on how you take missing persons cases seriously, and how doing so can prevent or thwart or help you catch potential serial killers or serial predators. And he, those recommendations were not vague. They were not academic. They were very specific. Things like create a dedicated missing persons team. Create a group of officers whose job it is to make sure that these cases never get forgotten, to make sure that there's constant follow-up, to make sure that there's constant attempts to see if there's linkages between open missing persons cases, to go to the public, to keep in touch with families, to maintain a public database, a public website, like I mentioned, that catalogs these cases and points the public to somewhere where they can look through them, that points the public to a website where they can, submit help, submit tips, submit information, and review those open cases, and that helps researchers and journalists look through those repositories to see if there might be a connection to a missing case or an unsolved murder or whatever in their hometown. Those are just a couple of the recommendations. I mean, Wally Opal also wrote extensively about how better community outreach, better community policing, about working with marginalized communities as opposed to policing them, and it's so incredibly detailed. And I sat at my desk in the Globe a couple of years ago reading that report, just absolutely furious. I mean, just unbelievably angry, because the reality is the Toronto Police ignored, I might even, many, maybe even most of those recommendations, or at the very least, didn't implement them with any sort of seriousness. And I called Wally Opal up. His number's not hard to find. I said, would you mind chatting? And he said, yeah, listen, I'll be very blunt with you. They've all purported to listen, and they absolutely have not. They have, and he was talking about police departments across the country. They've shirked their responsibilities here. They didn't listen to what he wrote, and what he said was, this is bound to happen again. This is how people get away with it, because you build systems with holes in them. You build systems that don't serve the communities that are most vulnerable. And that's exactly what Toronto Police did. By omission, they allowed a system to exist that just was never going to catch or connect missing persons cases of vulnerable people or marginalized people. That is the reality. And even today, they've set up a dedicated missing persons unit. It's quite small. I don't believe it has the funding necessary to do the role that Wally Opal described. They're still not extensively using that a national missing persons database that's now being run by the RCMP. They're using it to a minor degree, but not to the extent that I think they could. And it's frustrating, because you get the impression that this could happen again, and I think it could. There are other solutions. There are solutions that I think we ought to be talking about. There's a conversation right now about defunding the police, and I think it's a good one. At the very least, we have to talk about defunding areas of policing that don't serve and maybe even harm some of our communities. I talked about immigration enforcement. We are making vulnerable a lot of vulnerable people, because we are, basically using, a law enforcement process to round them up and try to send them back. We have a refugee system that inherently does not believe people who, I think, by the very definition, as Krishna Kumar Kanagaratnam's case shows you, who are by definition UN refugees. We have a system that still over polices a lot of queer communities, especially racialized communities, instead of stepping up to protect them. We still have a police system that over criminalizes sex work. We still have a police system that over criminalizes drug users, and those are people who are often targeted by serial killers, or at the very least violent predators. And it's very hard to build a system where you can work constructively with those communities to protect them, to protect each other, to help them report crime, to help them report missing persons cases or bring forward information on unsolved homicides. It's very hard to do all of that when with the other arm of the police department, you're trying to criminalize them, round them up, and police them out of addiction, police them out of their job, police them out of the streets. It's untenable. It's also worth remembering that Toronto police have spent decades, policing queer sexuality. I mean, they've spent decades raiding steam baths, arresting men in their own homes for, quote unquote prostitution, setting up stings to arrest men who cruise public bathrooms, setting up stings to cruise men to arrest men who cruise in public parks. And that was happening as recently as 2016, 2017.
I was going to say, this isn't necessarily historic.
No, and when I say this has happened for decades, I mean, the most recent bathhouse raid was under Julie Infantino's administration in the early 2000s of a lesbian party. There were raids on cruising grounds through the 2000s, like I said, up until the last couple of years. So it's really difficult to listen to police talk about the need to work with the queer community, the need to build relationships, when still a part of the relationship is being soured by your over-policing, by your moralizing, police structure, by a militarized police system, that still comes down hard on communities of the queer community. It's really difficult. It's impossible to do. I'll just come out and say, it is impossible to build those relationships. It's impossible to work constructively with the entire community when you're still criminalizing subsections of it. And I think, and that is a challenge to be met by federal and provincial governments more than it is cities, but police departments and municipalities need to talk seriously about this, because I don't know why we think we're going to get better results if we keep doing it. Over policing of sex work made women vulnerable in the downtown east side. Over criminalization of homelessness, of drug use, and of refugee status led to several of the men in this story being marginalized and vulnerable. And I don't know why we think that anything we're doing differently now is going to change that in the future, short of ending that over policing.
We're going to move on. There are several questions from the audience. Thank you for folks who have submitted that strike at the heart of something that I care passionately about, and something that you and I have had an opportunity to talk about before, and that is, the role of journalistic empathy, the role of what I might describe as trauma-informed journalism, the way in which we as journalists and the responsibility we have as journalists to take care of folks, even as we are reporting some of these stories. So I'm going to maybe read a couple of these questions, and you can sort of take the general frame as you wish. So one is a personal question to you. How did you cope with writing this story mentally? Did you find it hard not to get emotionally attached? There's another, in the postscript, you talked about the responsibility journalists have when they tell stories of people who have covered, or rather people who have experienced trauma, that you can't pretend covering that story doesn't impact them. Can you expand on that? And then the last one was from a young journalism student who said, I'm a young queer journalist here in Ottawa. I said student, this person just says, I'm a young queer journalist here in Ottawa. I don't have a lot of experience reporting on trauma. I'm a big fan of your work and was an avid listener of your Uncover podcast. While listening, I was always struck by how remarkably compassionate you were with all of your interview subjects. I second that. Do you have any advice on how I can bring the same level of respect and care to my own work? So tell us a little bit about your process and how you, I guess, wrote such a powerful book that has allowed you also to be okay with yourself in the end.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I'm not copying out when I say that it wasn't that difficult for me. Not that it wasn't difficult ever. There were days where I sat in front of my computer just bawling my eyes out. There were days where it still feels like I want to cry talking about this story, because it is difficult in a lot of respects. It's a difficult story. It's an unbelievably sad story. But, I think a career in journalism means kind of working through a lot of that stuff to get to something better, which I don't think has to be prescriptive. I think that's optimistic. I don't think you have to soldier through difficult stories or difficult emotions or difficult trauma just to get to that other side. Sometimes it's not worth it. But in my experience, it was always worth it for me. And I think that's and there were certainly times where I had to take days or weeks off. There's certainly times where I've gotten away. I have a very supportive partner who often does not want to talk about any of this stuff with me. I have a dog I had to go home to. I have my own coping mechanisms. For me, I don't like to tend to focus on my own difficulty in the story, because for me, it wasn't that difficult. It wasn't that difficult. It was always worth it for me. And if I needed to take a break, I always took it. But that being said, I think part of the reason why it wasn't as horrible for me as it could have been is because I didn't feel the need to go in and subject people to trauma that they didn't need to live through. I didn't see the need in re-victimizing, or at least I always say I hope I didn't. And I hope I didn't go in and re-victimize unnecessarily. A lot of these friends and family, people who have lived with this for so long. And fundamentally, I think that needs to be your ethos. I dealt with reporters on this story and on other stories who see nothing wrong with door knocking, the spouse or best friend or sister or son or whatever of a recently deceased person, a victim of a violent crime, knocking on their door in the minutes after the announcement comes. They see no reason not to cold call a victim's friend or family with gruesome details, or asking them probing questions that is grotesque and specific and horrible and macabre. And I know there's people who have see nothing wrong about trying to put a camera in someone's face as they leave the hospital, having just lost somebody. And I think getting away from doing that sort of journalism is also, it's easier to cope with it's easier to live with yourself, to be totally honest. It's easier to cover these stories if you don't feel like you're making a negative impact every day. I don't know I would be as okay with myself if I had to go and basically torture people as part of my job, emotionally subject them to things that they do not need or deserve to be subjected to. And I think there's a lot of advice in journalism, and maybe it's coming from an ethos of journalism school that's not been around in a couple of years, but it's certainly one I came up in. And I mentioned the story in the back of the book, but getting assigned a story by a first-year journalism school professor to go and interview somebody who's just recently lost a loved one, like really recently lost a close loved one, was for me the most kind of predatory style of journalism. It served no purpose. There was no story to tell. There was no impact to be made. It was a school assignment that no one was ever going to read, but they still wanted us to go out and sort of arm twist somebody into talking about their pain and loss for a grade. And I think if a lot of the times you have to sit there and just tell yourself, the person who's just lost someone, they don't owe anyone anything. There is no accountability to be brought here. They are not a person in power to whom I need to hold their feet to the fire. They are not somebody who has answers that I need to get. They are somebody who has been through something. And if anything, you should be working for their benefit. I know we always like to think like our readership, is who we really owe, our jobs to and our livelihood to. But the reality is, I think we really need to think long and hard about who we're going to impact the most with our coverage. And the reality is the victims of crime and their families, they read the things we write. And oftentimes it's very difficult for them to learn things, in our news reporting. It's difficult for them to see gruesome details. It's difficult for them to watch us get things wrong, to air dirty laundry of theirs, to put out things that, is going to be very difficult for them and their family to kind of live with. We need to think about that. And, there's always sort of a balancing test you have to do in those situations. But, increasingly over the years, my calculus has been, if it's going to ultimately hurt somebody who's already been hurt by this story, then how am I helping by writing it? What is in the public good about me using this salacious detail that I think is interesting, but ultimately serves no public good, and they're only going to hurt somebody who's already been through enough? And, that is ultimately the sort of math I try to do. And I'm sure I don't always kind of live up to my own standard, but it's something that at the very least is my thought process when going through a lot of these things. And when it comes to, even when it comes to even the specifics of interviewing people, you know, at the outset, you can say to somebody, if we touch on things you don't want to talk about, you just have to let me know. It's oftentimes you don't need that anecdote. You don't need that story. You know, it might be color, it might be useful, but there's always another story you can use. If that one story, you know, is one that touches on issues of, you know, in this story, you know, sexual assault or childhood trauma or, you know, personal family secrets or so on and so forth, you don't have a right to that story. If someone doesn't want to give it to you, often they'll overshare. But, you know, I think you really do need to negotiate with them and make sure they know that there is consequences to that thing going public, and that you don't have to publish it. They don't have to tell you. It doesn't have to go into the story. You know, there can be that negotiation because, again, these people are not someone you need to hold to account. These are not people who wield, you know, power in society. These are people who have, you know, almost quite the opposite, have experienced a total lack of power. And I think we need to think about that. We do have to think long and hard about how our work impacts other people. And I think all too often, a lot of journalists forget that.
Thank you for that. And do you feel like that perspective sets you apart from a lot of the journalists that you know, or that you reported this story alongside of? Or would you say that thinking is where people are moving toward?
I think it's where we're moving. Like, I wouldn't, like, it's not as though I'm, you know, came out of the womb enlightened. You know, this is a position I've come to over the last number of years, because this is not the only really difficult story I've covered. You know, I've covered terror attacks, I've covered other, you know, serial homicides, I've covered assault, and so on and so forth. You know, it is something that has certainly evolved. But my God, it would have been nice to have someone tell me this stuff in journalism school. And I think that's what's sort of frustrating about this, is that there's still a lot of journalists out there who have that very old school mentality. You know, just the other day I was reading, and I'll just, you know, I could pretend like I don't remember her name, but Rosie DiMano of the Toronto Star wrote some of the most horrifyingly transphobic and demeaning things about two trans women who were murdered in the late 90s. And it's hard to read. Like, it's literally grotesque. And you know, there were people still working in journalism who've never atoned for doing those sort of things, who've never atoned or apologized or explained their change of position, and in some respects continue to do it. You know, there are still writers at the Toronto Sun who, there was one particular writer who was writing homophobic screeds against the street hustlers of the village, calling them child pornographers and pedophiles. And this was published last year. You know, it's so when you ask me, you know, is it just me? No, it's not just me. There's a ton of great journalists who, you know, I think I fed off of it. I'm sure they fed off me. I think there's a community of us in the industry who try to think really, you know, and obviously you're in that camp, man, and I think you paved the way for a lot of this stuff, to be totally honest. You know, these conversations have been really productive, and these conversations have led to people like me sitting and thinking long and hard about a lot of these questions, and then changing my style of journalism because of it. But there's also plenty of people who still just are not with it, who are very much still stuck in the 90s. And unfortunately, I still think there's a lot of journalism professors. I hope there's not. I don't spend that much time in journalism schools anymore, but I expect that there's still a lot of professors who are of that old school mindset. And I think if you are, and I'm sure there's schools where you can get through 4 years and not have to think about the ethics of trauma or have to think about the ethics of compassion. And I think that's really frustrating. And I think you still see it, especially in TV. I don't mean to put my TV colleagues on blast, but I think especially in the TV journalism realm, there's just not often due diligence done on the impact that these stories have.
I'm hearing from our organizers. I'm just checking it. I think we're going to slip in maybe one more quick question, because Leanne was the first. Police failure in these cases has parallels to police failure in the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and violence against women in intimate relationships, domestic violence and sexual violence. Women have been working for years to address these failures. Police accountability, transparency, and oversight are long overdue. We now have piloted efforts to improve police response in several sites and are calling for greater transparency of police data about what they do with these reports. Do you see benefits benefiting from efforts of other groups as a possible strategy to improve police response to the queer community. So I guess, are there lessons that the queer community might benefit from work that is being done around intimate partner violence and other areas?
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly, you know, I think it's often amazing to me the way in which communities that have found themselves over-policed but underserved by, you know, the cities they live in don't link up and don't have conversations or solidarity on a lot of those questions, you know, don't often have a unified front, and in some cases are played off against each other. You know, that's a really frustrating thing to watch. You know, as part of the work for the podcast we did, and as for this book, you know, I got the opportunity to go back and consult, you know, a lot of fantastic kind of historical records on, you know, the bathhouse raids, on homicides targeting, you know, queer and racialized people through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so on. And in particular, there's, and I think I mentioned briefly in the book, but there, you know, there's one instance in 1981 after the bathhouses have been raided, where there were thousands of pissed off queer people, you know, marching on police headquarters, you know, potentially ready to instigate a riot. You know, this was, you know, a total emulation of the Stonewall riots. And what actually kind of eased the tension was a woman named LaMonica Johnson, whose husband had been shot and killed by police in his home while experiencing what may have been a mental health episode. And it's really eerie to see some of the similarities, you know, the fact that, you know, going back to 1981, you were seeing a lot of the same, you know, calls for justice around, you know, police overuse of force on racialized and Black people in particular. And then a lot of the same complaints from the queer community saying, you know, the homicide rate here is so much higher and yet you can't solve these cases. And yet you have all of these time and resources to raid the baths and arrest us in parks. You know, we're getting the long arm of the law, but we're not getting served by justice in our own communities. And I find, you know, it's sort of frustrating to often see, you know, the Indigenous community in Canada, you know, the Black community and queer people kind of working in silos, you know, to try to reform systems of policing. And I think, quite honestly, a lot of the grievances and a lot of the complaints and a lot of the suggestions for improvement are often quite similar, and or at the very least, you know, analogous. And it's often frustrating to not see those complaints take on a more kind of unified front. And I think, you know, I'm not the activist here, so I won't try to tell, you know, activist communities what they ought to be doing. But, you know, I think it is in some ways disappointing that a lot of the suggestions on how to reform criminal justice and policing, you know, often exist in very separate universes. You know, there is a conversation happening around Indigenous overrepresentation in prisons. There's a separate conversation happening about Black overrepresentation in prisons. There's a separate conversation to be had about the overcriminalization of queer communities and based on sexuality. And I think politicians are really happy about that. Politicians are really happy to deal with those things in piecemeal, you know, to do, you know, make some admittedly good changes, but, you know, long overdue changes to HIV non-disclosure criminalization, and then to make some changes around Gladue reports around Indigenous sentencing for Indigenous people, then to make some changes on, you know, what policing looks like in predominantly Black communities. And often it doesn't take on the sort of fulsome reform that we desperately need. And I think it's long overdue. And I think the Black Lives Matter calls for defunding the police is finally putting a more fulsome conversation about substantive structural change at the forefront. And I think it's long overdue. You know, this you know, these changes are 50 years out of date. And it's time we gotta act fast, or else, you know, I think we're going to continue seeing lesser outcomes as we go forward.
Justin, do you have it in you for two more questions from the audience?
Sure. Let's do it.
So we have talked a little bit. So folks, I'll ask a couple more questions and we'll maybe wrap up by 8:45 for those following along. You just touched on race and the intersections, and there have been a couple of questions about that. So, you know, one is asking you to reflect on the racism and classism from the queer community that you uncovered. And we sort of talked about that earlier. But the other, and this person has said, as a white cis queer male, and please correct me if I misspoke, what reflection, active work, or critical dialogue did you engage with the racial communities impacted by these losses before and as you were writing this book to approach the racism involved in with these stories? and what insights into racism in the GTA was revealed to you. So maybe your thoughts on those two, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, and you're quite right. I'm queer, but cisgender and quite white, as you can see from my somewhat pink complexion. I have literally a pink neon light behind me. It's kind of accenting it. Listen, I've had conversations over the years, extensive conversations with members of the trans community, both activists and just members who have experienced violence or who have experienced difficulties in policing, as most members of the trans community have. And I tried to speak often and extensively with folks who were in the South Asian community, which got particularly active around this case, the Arab community, the Black community. But I mean, I will be very upfront in that this book is not going to lay out the issues around race and racism in the same way as a lot of other racialized people would be able to do. That is just the reality of kind of my experience. I think I tried to make room in this book for people to sort of showcase how some of those systemic failures for racialized communities exist. But this is I think this book is one part of the conversation. It's by no means the authoritative last word on a lot of those topics, and it can be really difficult to untangle all of the ways in which race and racism had a role in this story. I believe the officers in this case when they say, and they've said to me and they've said to others, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, immigrant status had nothing to do with it. We wanted to solve these cases, and that's what that was our end goal. And it didn't much matter, who they were, what they looked like, and so on. And I actually believe them. But it would be very easy if all we had to do were fire all the racist, sexist, homophobic officers and everything would be okay. And the reality is it's not that simple. The unconscious biases and the unconscious racism and the structural racism of a lot of these systems, is what the problem is. And there's one thing I keep coming back to. It's that throughout this working on the story, I was pestering the cops long before there was an arrest. And the one thing that seemed to keep coming back was this idea that there's actually a phrase for it, and a phrase that I find really bizarre. It's that some of these men may have just vacated their lives. In essence, they grabbed their passport, they grabbed their wallet, they went and hopped a flight back. Often it was back home, and I use that with scare quotes because for a lot of these men, their home was Canada. They had left Afghanistan or Sri Lanka or so forth, years prior. But for many of the police officers I spoke to, or the folks around the investigation that I spoke to, there was this innate belief that sometimes queer people or Arab people or South Asian people just pick up and disappear, like it's something innate or just by default of racialized or queer people. And just hearing that and thinking back to it, it's so insulting. It's so insulting, and it's so indicative of officers in a police department that often find it easy to explain away these cases. And that is, I think, the most pernicious sort of form of racism that you're going to find in the story. The ability to look past these cases because you just don't really get it, because you don't really understand fully the lived experience of these folks. And there was one case where Abdulbasir Faizi, his car was found abandoned only about a block from where his body was ultimately discovered. He left his wallet in his car, or he didn't access his credit cards or his debit cards. He left his passport at home. His name didn't pop up on any immigration or border agency database, and yet police still seem to think that he had just vacated his life and gone back home, whatever that's supposed to mean. So I keep coming back to a system where we can sort of explain away or forgive or find justification to forget cases of people who don't look like us. It strikes me as sort of the almost the most troubling embodiment of a system that is still so disconnected from the people they're supposed to be serving.
And, you know, I hear a link in that between you mentioned Wally Opal earlier, and that was, you know, a big finding in the missing women from the downtown East Side, was that families were being told, you know, she's just, you know, she's a transient, she probably has just disappeared for a while. And these families would say, okay, we understand that she may have a life that doesn't look like yours, but she also calls us every Thursday at 4 o'clock to let us know she's okay. So
that's right.
You know, you have to trust that. I guess the last question, and you kind of addressed this in the opening of the book when you sort of explain what this book isn't. But what are your thoughts around the, you know, there's a question here about true crime, and this book is definitely not true crime. And what are your thoughts around the potentially exploitive nature of true crime stories? We know that, for instance, true crime podcasts and shows on Netflix like Making a Murderer are really in vogue right now. You know, how do you think authors can ensure that that stories don't end up that way?
So I'll answer this question by answering another question that I saw in the Q&A a minute ago. And the question was, you know, why did you decide to write this book? And, you know, the actual answer is I didn't want to. I tried really hard not to write this book. I had actually, while covering another gruesome homicide many years ago, had actually been kind of approached and convinced to write a book. And I remember sitting there and sort of putting together some of the elements and writing a couple of the chapters back then and thinking to myself, this is horrible. Why? I wouldn't want to write this. I wouldn't want to read this book. I don't want to write this book. I don't know what this book does. I can only imagine this book will be difficult for people to read. And at most, this is going to go on sale for true crime buffs who just get, you know, some sort of twisted either pleasure or sort of some you know, external, you know, explanation from reading these books. And I thought to myself, you know, why would I want to do that? I'm not doing, and I just discarded it and said, I'm not finishing this. Zero interest. Thank you, but no thank you. So when I was working, you know, when Bruce McArthur was arrested, and when I was at the Globe and Mail working on this story full time, it was Robin Doolittle who came up to me and said, you know, here's my agent's card. Give them a call. I think you'll have a great chat. And I said, you know, Robin, thank you. I really appreciate it. But, you know, I'm happy here at the Globe. We're doing great work here. I have zero interest in focusing on a book. And she wouldn't take no for an answer. I said, just talk to my agent. Just shut up. Just talk to her. So I go for lunch and I proceed to just rant at my future agent about all of the things I hate about true crime, all of the ways in which, you know, My Favorite Murder and the Netflix genre of true crime have, you know, bastardized and exploited what is the worst days of people's lives for entertainment. And all too often, you know, it is the veneer of journalism, but it is fundamentally entertainment. And often there is no structural failures, at least not identified by a lot of these works. You know, there are no systemic issues identified. You know, I think just looking at these cases, you'd notice that predominantly the victims at the heart of a lot of these stories are white women, which is not in and of itself a problem. There's plenty to be written about violence targeting women, but you start to realize that the stories are being picked to target an audience. And we know that the audience for true crime is predominantly white women. So, you know, all these things are going through my head. I'm bloating this out of my future agent. I just don't want to do it. And she says, you know, okay, for all those problems, do the opposite of that. Go write a book that is none of those things. Go write a book that rejects all of those things and write it however you want to write it. And we'll worry about selling it. And I was skeptical, to say the least, but I went and I started working on a book, and it was amazing the degree to which every publisher I spoke to said, we're happy to have it. Fine. Don't do any of those things. Do whatever you'd like, and we'll take the end product. And, you know, it was a process where, you know, I was never pushed or encouraged to go for the salacious route. There's only ever supported by, you know, my publisher, my agent, and kind of everyone along the way. And, you know, I hope this book rejects as many true crime tropes as you can find. You know, I think there's parts in here that, you know, that are written with some literary flourish. But I tried to do so, and maybe I didn't succeed. Again, you know, I'm not a perfect author. There's maybe some areas where it still lists a little bit into that true crime genre, but as much as possible, I tried to connect everything to, you know, real, obvious problems, potential solutions into the system, and to kind of in a parallel track, tell the stories of not just these men, but of the people they left behind and the difficult realities they still face And that part of the story, unfortunately, rarely gets told in a long form way. And I kind of hope, and I think I'll end this by saying, I hope that, this is proof positive, as is the podcast we did, that you can go out there and you can write these stories, and there will be a market for them. There is ways you can adapt, this style of reporting, this effort to go back and look at the historical inequities that lead to cases like this, that look at, the structural failures of police and cities and communities and governments, and that still humanizes people in the process. I think that's very possible, and I think there's a growing appetite for that type of story. And I think all we need are the people to tell them.
Well, we are lucky that there is you to tell this story, and we are lucky that you shared some of your thoughts with us tonight. Justin Ling, there's a round of applause in the ether for you right now. Everyone can do jazz hands.
Thank you.
Thank you to the Ottawa Public Library, the Ottawa International Writers Festival, and the Library and Archives Canada for this event. The next author event will be a book launch for One Good Reason with Sean McCann and Andrea Aragon. That's on Saturday, October 10th at noon. In this deeply personal memoir, co-written with wife Andrea Aragon, singer-songwriter and renowned mental health, addiction, and recovery advocate Sean McCann leaves no stone unturned. So if that's of an interest for you, that is coming up on Saturday, October 10th. In the meantime, as it was mentioned, this book, Missing from the Village, is available at Perfect Books in Ottawa. I'm sure you can also find it at a bookstore near you, not Amazon. And we thank you so much, Justin, for your time and your sharing tonight.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank everyone who joined us.
Yes, and thank everyone for being here. The support has been fantastic. I really appreciate it.
I'm really disappointed that we didn't get any questions about the real heart of the story, which is how good of an indoor gardener you are.
It's not mine. Here's the big lie. This is my friend's place. I'm staying with a friend right now. These would not survive me.
All right. The truth is out. Well, maybe in the future it'll be a gardening book.
I don't think so.
Best wishes and thank you so much.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone. Take care of yourselves.